Well, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us today for I Am Online. This is Dean Woodbeck with InCommon, and I want to point out a couple of things on the features of the Zoom. We'll be doing, as we usually do, the questioning by the chat. The chat button's down at the bottom of your screen. When you go to the chat, there's a drop-down menu by the to line. If you would click on that and then click on all, or click on everyone in meetings so everybody can see your questions and the responses. That's not the default, but that's something we'd like you to do so everybody can see what's going on. And without further ado, I will introduce David Bantz, who is at the University of Alaska and is vice chair of CTAB, and he's going to talk today about Baseline Expectations version 2. David?
Thanks, Dean. So Baseline Expectations is a program of InCommon, really, run by the CTAB, the Community Trust and Assurance Board. Let's see, am I sharing my slides accurately?
Yep, looks good. The title slide is up.
Okay, great. So the outline for the presentation is pretty simple. Describe the program in a few slides, goals, and the processes we used. What's the current state? And then finally the next steps, in which we're hoping for some participation from others.
Excuse me, David.
The Community Trust and Assurance Board.
You might want to turn off your video, David. It's breaking up a little bit.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Turn off the video. Lost my stop video. Okay. Well, this is the board. Includes people from around the country at universities primarily, and a couple of folks from Internet 2 InCommon. So the meme or sort of icon we have is a pyramid. We want to encourage collaboration through the interoperability of our identity providers and service providers that participate in federations, in InCommon Federation or the wider Federation of Federation EduGain. And we're sort of working from bottom up to have a foundation of really good and accurate descriptions of all of the participants in metadata, and then ingredients to increase the level of assurance that one has in assertions or data from one another, and then eventually gets a collaboration up on top with the guy waving the flag there. So a little more formal presentation of the program. The dimensions, the kinds of things that we're looking at to ultimately increase collaboration and interoperability include security, privacy, transparency, appropriate good user experience for the end users, and of course to facilitate other new services and identity providers joining the Federation. We do that through a process that is always engaging the entire community. Community really sets the requirements. It's a process facilitated by CTAB, the board, but ultimately determined by the community with a consensus process. And in case of disputes about whether or not some entity is meeting requirements or has some other problem, there's a community dispute resolution process. And this has the force of the participation agreement, which was amended slightly recently to require participants to actually meet these baseline expectations. So actually, the way we're implementing this over on the right side of the image, the foundation is really doing a thorough metadata check that the basic ingredients like the name of the organization and contacts for support and security are within the metadata, and an assertion by identity providers that this identity provider is good enough to be used for key central operations that are mission critical at your institution. So a kind of confidence building ingredients. So some of the additional elements we're looking at, and we'll talk about in moments, are use of an error URL. Some people think that should have been part of the first foundation step. Certify, TLS hardening, MFA signaling, it's multi-factor authentication, and attribute bundles. So we're very aware that the Federation is diverse and includes, for example, research SPs, university, identity providers, vendors, all with different capacities, different mission statements. We don't all have a common boss or a common end in mind. So we're very much sharing the road and joining a federation, sometimes for different purposes, but ultimately to collaborate. The community consensus process in a little bit more detail. Anyone can raise an issue on the email list presented here, and that will trigger, or can trigger, some involvement by the Community Trust and Assurance Board to facilitate a discussion, invite other people into the conversation, and ultimately come to a community-based consensus. So in formulating the details, we did actually look at the famous IETF rough consensus and humming, which is referenced there. And I don't actually have one of these t-shirts, but I think some of the folks on CTAB do. So, baseline expectations for one, which basically was implemented through 2018 and 2019, that the services, the participant, identity provider or service providers operated as core institutional service, has organizational level authority, and generally follows accepted security practices. We specifically looked in this version 1 stage at the technical, administrative, and security contacts being in the metadata that's submitted to the Federation. There's some user interface information, including a logo and a name of the service, and a link, a URL for the privacy policy of the organization. We didn't drill down into making sure people were actually responding to the emails listed in the contacts, or that the privacy policy was helpful, but at least there is something there, a place to start if there is an issue or a question or a problem to be resolved. Yeah. So how'd we do? This is a graph, thanks to Albert, that indicates the progress both for identity providers, service providers, and for organizations as a whole. An organization may have one or more of each IDP or SP. And we're essentially at 100% compliance with baseline expectations. Look at the details in the call box in black, there are one or two we're still, but essentially 100% participation. And interestingly, the compliance was really on an upward trend even before we officially transitioned to enforcing baseline, going through the process. And on the announced deadline that everybody was supposed to be up to expectations, we were about the 90% level. That process required members of the Community Trust and Assurance Board to reach out and email or telephone or use campus directories to find folks who are operating the SP or the IDP and try and help them come into compliance with these requirement baseline expectations. There were very few cases in which we found that the service or identity provider was really not actively in use and there was no interest on the part of the organization. I don't know if Albert has a number of the participants that actually ended up leaving rather than meeting expectations, but it was a small number. Do you know that number, Albert?
I don't have the exact number off the top of my head. It's a small number though.
Okay. Okay. So this involved a lot of work over the 2-year period, not just by CTAB, but by all of the participants, and also by folks running InCommon to do the automated checks and reports and modification of the onboarding process, all of which were required to do this. So have we seen any benefits? Well, I think we do, and I've listed some categories here. And maybe the first, and some people have said the most important thing, is it demonstrates a certain maturity of the InCommon Federation. We have a good base of uniform, sound operating principles. So new organizations can have some confidence in joining InCommon, that they can rely on federations rather than doing one-to-one integrations, which don't scale. And we also had a chance to exercise a little bit our consensus and dispute resolution processes so that we don't actually have a functioning way to deal with non-conforming entities or disputes if they arise. So I think everyone should have a degree of confidence in the maturity of the InCommon Federation and should encourage additional participants. We've seen it be a spur to other national or international identity federations. Some of us have talked about whether an analog or parallel to what we call baseline expectations would be useful in EDUGAIN, the Federation of National Federations. Of course, part of our hope is to contribute to the efficiency of onboarding and requiring more complete metadata with information that really facilitates onboarding and SP, IDP interaction is part of what we're seeing the benefits. And I would say personally, and I ask others to chime in, it's even for organizations that are not part of InCommon, I refer to those baseline expectations in my discussion with them and say, you know, first of all, it'd be easiest if you joined InCommon Federation. If you're unable or uninterested in doing that, I still would like your metadata to include these best practices. And to some extent there, I've seen some cooperation, and my locally maintained metadata then for service providers, I'm an IDP operator, I think is increased, even for organizations that are not part of InCommon. All right, so what are the next steps? CTAB has been discussing most of the year, well, it even goes other ingredients that would help Federation participants rely on assertions and information from one another and ultimately facilitate more interoperability. And I've listed 5 here. The first is the TLS, or the SSL connections between endpoints. We've talked about requiring hardening. As you undoubtedly know, a lot of the earlier SSL and TLS protocols are considered vulnerable, and some of the encryption in some SSL connections use cryptographic suites that have also been shown to be vulnerable to different kinds of hacks. So hardening that up to make sure we have an unbroken connections that are encrypted with unbroken protocols and encryption suites. Details, obviously, a little tricky to spell out. It's a moving target, but we can talk about that more. Second piece is certify, or most people say certify, a framework for security incident response that includes some rules of the road for how you respond to incidents. And that would be a self-evaluation and assertion in your metadata that you conform to the profile, which is in the footnote down at the bottom of the slide. The third element, which I mentioned some people think should have been part of our first level complete metadata, is that IDPs should publish an error URL, and SPs should use and refer users to that URL if the SP does not receive the attributes it needs for a user, so that hopefully the user can do whatever is required at the identity providing organization to change things so that they can get access or recognize that they're not going to be able to. Fourth item is labeled here multi-factor authentication. And what we meant by that and mean by that is signaling the use of whether or not you're using multi-factor authentication by using, in the authentication context, the refeds authentication context. It's basically this, you know, that a service provider could say, I want MFA. Well, you'd use the refeds MFA context. And an identity provider could say, could either assert, yes, this person authenticated with a method that conforms to that context, or not, in which case, you know, the user doesn't get access, but we know why. And finally, the use of attribute bundles. Research and scholarship attribute bundle has been part of InCommon for quite a few years, and really facilitates you know, the integration of new services to IDPs without a lot of one-to-one negotiation about what attributes are released. If you automatically release that attribute bundle and the service provider can consume that RNS bundle, you're done. There might be a need for a refinement or other versions of attribute bundles. So that's still a point of discussion. So in looking at those 5 possible components, I mean, we're very aware, and the people and organizations that CTAB has talked to are concerned about the right balance between putting, you know, really ramping up the level of assurance and trust by conforming to those new requirements. On the other hand, some organizations may find them too burdensome and not be able to continue participating or not be able to comply, versus going very slowly or very modestly up the assurance ladder, with the risk that the federation becomes less relevant. We know of examples where organizations feel they need a level of assurance that's higher than can be um, currently gleaned from InCommon participation, and has side processes to respond to that lack of full trust in InCommon participants. And of course, if ultimately that makes the Federation, sort of circle the drain there. So CTAB conducted a survey during the past year of what our organizations and people outside of InCommon were able to participate as well, of these different components. Should they be prioritized to be part of baseline expectations in 2020? There were 87 responses, and there were a number of questions, and I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. But the first one was, and simply, should this be a priority for InCommon Federation to require all participants to do TLS hardening, listed as TLS 1.2 here, certify AIR URL, research and scholarship attribute bundle, and the ReFeds MFA authentication context. And seemed to fall into three buckets of a clear yes for TLS hardening, strong support for certify and the AIR URL, and weaker but still significant prioritization for the final two, RNS and ReFeds MFA. So we encourage people to comment. There was another allowed for choice. For all of the CTAB members read all of the comments that were provided by the 87 responders. And we jiggled a bit with different ways to weight and sum those and the like. And I've got a link there to a blog post that we did that talks in more detail about those results. But ultimately, we end up with the same threefold division, and a significant number of people that thought it was important to end up supporting those five components of baseline expectations, but couldn't we just wait another year? So you see here the number of participants that said, let's do it not next year, but the year after that in 2021, which reminded me of what's sometimes called the Wayward Prayer of St. Augustine. So that was a quick run through current status and the contemplation of next steps, the five potential components of future baseline expectations. In addition to just considering those five that we've listed, other questions you might want to think about is whether we need greater collaboration and common ingredients in baseline expectations with other federations, or indeed in EduGain itself, the Federation of Federations. And then we've sort of wondered, I don't know that it's gone too much beyond that, whether we need automated checks to ensure, for example, that the contact information, if you send an email, do you actually get a response? Is it a valid email? That user interface elements, links to logos and so on actually work and display a logo. And I want to advertise our open meeting at TechX on Wednesday at lunchtime in the meeting hotel. I believe that's it. I may run through that too quickly, but
so we did have one question, David, that came in, and I'll just read it. Understand you can only graph what you can measure, but to my inexpert eye, it seems like the more important expectations, such as verifying that SPs are not sharing the data with third parties or using it for advertising, aren't represented in the chart. Are there any efforts or thoughts to track or improve compliance with those expectations?
I appreciate the comment, and yeah, that's from Jerry Shipman, and I think he's identified the difficulty is how, I guess, how would we know? We do have the dispute resolution process. I mean, so if it turns out some SP is in fact sharing data and we discover that fact, we have a way to address that. But I think we should keep that on the agenda. No easy solution occurs to me. I see the next comment as well. And this has been extensively discussed, widely discussed, I'd say, that some institutions have, it says registrars here, it could be any number of offices that get very nervous about releasing information about people in an automated way. And that is indeed one of the apparently wider adoption of the current research and scholarship attribute bundle. Some of us have noted that the concern is usually more focused on students' information because of FERPA, and that releasing the RNS bundle might not require that you release it for everybody, just for those that you actually have that data for. So if you have a repository that does not include some of the RNS information for students, I mean, you don't have it, so it's not a requirement that you have that information for everybody who can authenticate. That's the way I put it. Or it doesn't have to be read that way. Since we haven't written a formal baseline expectation, I guess, there's some openness there.
This is Albert. I might also add that this is an area where consent based release might come in real handy if you have a registrar that's very privacy minded, or generally data store that's very privacy minded. Consent based release might be the way to go.
Yep. Dean, I don't know if you can do a survey of the 53 attendees easily. Probably not if you haven't reloaded it. But I'd be curious what people thought about any of the 5 components that are being discussed.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's not a feature of Zoom. We used to be able to do that in Adobe Connect.
Oh, sorry. RFE to Zoom. How many InCommon participants already meet the proposed requirements? I don't know that we've run those statistics, Albert.
We haven't sampled that yet. And a couple of those things, for example, verifying TLS 1.2 would either require us to scan, which we do not do today, or require participants to self-attest, which we haven't asked for yet.
So I know my IDP meets all 5, but I was early out of the box on baseline V1 as well. Yeah, so everyone can see Jerry Shipman's comment, which I think is apt. So the concern of data stewards about release of attributes is connected with the appropriate use of that information by the services that receive them. So being able to assert that the services are not going to republish or sell the information they get as part of an attribute release from an identity provider should relieve some of the concern that the institution is not just inappropriately, but even illegally spilling personal information of students that isn't directory information. So Tim Johnson says, TLS will be the biggest challenge due to the legacy applications. I'm not sure I understand why. Oh, Judy Bush wants me to push, okay. Is that the slide you wanted, Judy, or do you want the earlier one that just named them? Albert, do you want to get out your banjo and fill the time?
So open forum, questions. Let's see, when I present the survey, to make it a baseline. So do you see Judith's comment about additional bundled?
Yes, so that's a comment that we've heard a couple of times. The current research and scholarship bundle was pretty, I don't know how, I wasn't part of the initial foundation of that, but it's a small limited set of attributes, and there's certainly some other possible uses where a smaller or a larger set of attributes would be appropriate. One size doesn't fit all. Yeah.
So I'm going to stretch here a little bit and comment on Scott's comment about the adoption rate of RNS. One of the things that I'm seeing from as a federation operator is that not all IDPs are substantially focused on research collaboration. And the less research focused they are, as in the smaller number of researchers they have in their institution relative to the overall population, the harder it is for them to justify an RS type release where it's all or nothing. That's why I comment on the consent based idea. That is not to say RNS is not valuable. The fact that there is a defined bundle of attributes and a way to exchange that helps a lot, and it helps ease the eventual user experience when it comes to making decisions about a release. I just think we may need to look into investing in consent mechanisms more, especially for the institutions that are either very privacy focused or have relatively small percentage of the users that are researchers. The comment is the promise of InCommon was scalable trust, and it's not scaling as far as we had hoped. that's the continued work, right? Part of the baseline effort is to do exactly that, is to essentially raise the bar, right? Get us all up to a fairly common, even playing ground, and eventually improve interoperability. It's a journey, and as I'm sure everyone who has been in this space for a while knows, there are varying needs and opinions, and navigating through that is the challenge, right? But it's also why we do what we do.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, two specific suggestions we're hearing here, not that we haven't heard versions of them before, is more than one attribute bundle and relying on consent. I know Shibboleth has a way to do consent release built into it. I don't know about the other software that Federation participants may be relying on. I don't know if you do, Albert.
I have not looked into it deeply. I'm a fan. I'm a fan of CAR, the work coming out of Duke University. So I tend to look into that as the promised land, if you will. And I think CAR is very close to release, official release.
Okay, what's CAR?
Yeah, I'm sorry, CAR, consent attribute release. It's essentially a companion application to your IDM stack, and it provides a user interface for both the end user as well as the university administrator to manage how attributes and information is released. The users gets to choose, the administrators gets to set restrictions on what they can release and what they override. So it's meant for a large-scale management of it. It's a combination of individual choice and enterprise or a university decision. And I think if implemented, deployed into the environment properly, can really go a long way solving this attribute sharing, release, exchange issues we face today. And I used to be at UCLA, and speaking in that formal hat, I've been waiting for CAR for years, because it really does essentially tick all the boxes that all the challenges we face at a university, of balancing a large-scale release to ease integration and dealing with user privacy. And Dean is linking the posting links to the CAR blogs.
Ken did a couple of demos that are in that blog, and also there will be, if you're going to be at TechX next week, there'll be Duke is doing a session on CAR, which I think will also include a demo.
Question, do I know if it works with ADFS? I do not know if it works with ADFS. It's a good question to follow up on, though. I will ask. So I guess I have a question for folks online, and feel free to put it in the chat. Do these 5 elements look like reasonable targets to aim for in the next couple of years? Are we missing anything blatant that we should add?
a kind of parallel question is whether some of these might be okay, not as a baseline requirement that everybody has to do or stop participating, or it could be flagged in some way so that an organization that needs the higher level of assurance could filter on that or otherwise trigger a different response. Well, I see 2 votes saying realistic.
Also, just a comment on specifically 2 items that are that CTAB thought would require more discussion, and that's RNS and refeds MFA. There is going to be follow-up conversations about what those items really mean and how to practically implement them, if you will. That makes sense. David has already alluded to some of it. For example, in RNS, it doesn't necessarily have to mean you have to release attributes for every single person in your identity store. It's really only those who reasonably have to collaborate on research activities. What that means for the campuses or for the IDP operators to be determined. Same thing with the refeds MFA. There are some sort of back channel user experience use cases that we still need to work through. So if you have an interest in those areas, please let us know. Let CTAB know. We are happy and really are looking for guidance and expertise in this area.
Oh, yeah, pairwise ID, the new identifiers. You know, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about those in CTAB as conceivably part of baseline, that we ask people to adopt the 2 new identifiers, the pairwise and what's the other one named? Subject ID, yes. That's it. You know, I think that's a good suggestion.
And just a comment on that, the deployment profile working group, which is a working group from the InCommon Technical Advisory Committee, wrapped up their report, a working report earlier in the year, and TAC just is reviewing those recommendations right now, and will be basically generating its follow-up from that. And that in that report, of course, is this topic, subject ID, pairwise IDs. So pretty sure there will be follow-up conversations, possibly even at TAC about this, at TechX about this next week.
Well, I think, David, unless you have any other closing remarks, we can put a wrap on this.
Yeah, thank you for participating. Some good suggestions, and I hope to see folks in New Orleans at TechX at our Wednesday lunch meeting.
Yeah, and thank you too, David, for spending the time to put this together today. And also, if there are any members of CTAB on the line, for your continued work on baseline expectations and raising trust. So thanks everybody for joining us today, and have a good rest of your day.